The air in the Nacogdoches headquarters was heavy, thick with the scent of leather, sweat, and an ambition that soured Texan pride. General Marshal Carver Harrison, a man whose posture was stiffer than his honor, stood before his officers. His face, a mop of arrogance, was impassive. His eyes, small and calculating, scanned the men who were supposed to be the backbone of Texas's defense. Instead, he saw only pawns. As of today, his voice cut the silence like a cold blade. The war contribution order will be executed. All properties north of the Sabine River that cannot prove production for the war effort will be reallocated under this regiment's command. A euphemism for theft. A younger officer, his face honest and not yet corroded by cynicism, dared to ask, "General, does that include the veterans' lands? Men who have already shed their blood?" Harrison's reply was a thin, almost invisible smile. "Loyalty isn't a credit, Lieutenant. It's a daily debt, and some are in default." At that very instant, over 50 miles away, the hot wind blew red dust across Elijah Coleman's farm. He didn't hear the general's words, but he felt them in the air, like an animal senses the approach of a storm. Elijah was a man shaped by the land. His hands were thick and calloused. His gaze was long, accustomed to measuring the horizon, and his soul carried the silent stubbornness of the oak. He wasn't a hero of tales, but a man of promises, and the greatest of them had been made to his wife, Adeline Bennett, when they drove the first stake for that house. "Here, we will be free." Adeline, watching from the porch, saw the subtle shift in his stance. He stopped mending the fence, the hammer hanging inert in his hand. The silence between them needed no words. Both knew that freedom in Texas was a daily cultivation, as fragile as the first corn seedling. Years ago, Elijah, still a boy, had seen Davy Crockett speak in the San Antonio Square. He didn't remember all the words, but the feeling never left him, that a leader spoke with the people, not at the people. Crockett didn't use terms like reallocation. He spoke of home, of faith, and of a man's right to protect what he built with his own hands. This was the Texas Elijah had fought for, not the Texas of armchair generals whose boots had never touched the mud of real battle. A brief flashback, quick as lightning, flashed through his mind. A year earlier, an Army quartermaster sent by Harrison had come to inspect his production. The man was polished, polite, but his eyes cataloged everything, not with admiration, but with covetousness. "A fine property, Mr. Coleman," he had said. "General Harrison greatly appreciates patriots who make the land prosper." At the time, Elijah felt a shiver, a distrust he brushed away as disloyalty. He believed in the cause. He believed sacrifice was necessary. He ignored the instinct screaming that some men used the flag to hide their own greed. Now, the sound of approaching hooves broke the afternoon peace. It wasn't a lone messenger, it was a detachment, and at their head, imposing on his black horse, came General Marshal Carver Harrison himself. He hadn't come to chat, he had come to take. Harrison dismounted, his immaculate uniform an insult to the farm's dust. "Coleman," he said, without the "Mr., "your property has been deemed of low strategic yield. It will be placed under military administration." Elijah drove the hammer into the wooden beam. His eyes, calm and steady, met the general's. "This land produces enough to feed my family and still send a third of everything to the soldiers on the front, General. The records prove it." Harrison laughed, a dry, joyless sound. "Records can be reinterpreted. What matters is my assessment. You have until tomorrow's sunset to remove your personal belongings." Adeline descended the porch steps, her face pale, but her spine erect. "This is theft, General. It's not the law." "I am the law in this region, madam," Harrison replied, his gaze lingering on her a moment longer than necessary, an act of silent, humiliating power. He turned to leave, but paused and looked back at Elijah. A final warning. "I advise against resistance, Coleman. Texas has little patience for traitors." As the detachment rode away, stirring up a cloud of dust that seemed to soil the very sky, Elijah remained motionless. He felt no anger, not yet. He felt a deep ache, the ache of betrayal. The flag he honored was being used to dispossess him. The freedom he had fought for was becoming a cage. He looked at the horizon, at the sun beginning to dip. He had until tomorrow. But Harrison had made a fundamental mistake. He thought he had broken a rancher. Little did he know, he had just awakened the soldier within the man. And if you believe an ordinary man cannot stand against power, just wait and see what happens when a Texan's honor is wounded. Night fell over the Coleman farm like a shroud. There was no sleep. With every creak of the house's wood, Adeline flinched, expecting the soldier's return. Elijah, however, was quiet, a dangerous quiet. He wasn't cleaning his weapons or barricading the doors. He was sitting at the kitchen table, a map of the territory spread out under the flickering lamplight. He wasn't planning a battle, but a war. Harrison's injustice wasn't just against him, it was a cancer spreading through the body of Texas. The next day, the humiliation deepened. Harrison, to ensure his authority wasn't questioned, sent his men not only to Elijah's farm, but to 2 other neighboring properties, belonging to families who lacked the strength or the name to resist. News spread like wildfire. In town, Elijah Coleman's name began to be whispered with a mix of pity and fear. Harrison was cunning. He hadn't publicly accused him of treason yet, but he had planted the seed. "Coleman resisted a military order in wartime," his spokesman said. "He puts his profit above Texas." Suddenly, neighbors who had once greeted him with a tip of their hat now looked away. Isolation was a weapon as effective as a rifle. The general, secure in his power, increased the pressure. He confiscated Elijah's cattle under the pretense that they were needed to feed the troops. But Adeline, on one of her rare trips to town, saw the same animals being sold to a merchant complicit with the general. The profit went directly into Harrison's pocket. The general's arrogance was his weakness. He believed brute force and fear were enough to control men. He didn't understand what truly motivated a man like Elijah. One night, looking at the moon over his now empty fields, Elijah remembered another moment with Crockett. Not a conversation, but an observation. He had seen him, after a long and heated political meeting, step out into the courtyard and share his canteen of water with a young recruit on guard duty. A simple gesture, but it said it all. A leader serves. A tyrant is served. Crockett wasn't a general, he was a representative. He bent down to listen, not to be revered. The memory solidified Elijah's resolve. Facing Harrison with violence would be suicide. He would be killed and branded a lawbreaker, an example to all others. His family's honor would be stained forever. No, justice needed to be as smart as Harrison's corruption was devious. He needed to unmask the general, not just defeat him. Adeline became his eyes and ears. Under the guise of selling jams and breads at the market, she listened to the soldiers' conversations. Most were young, idealistic, but discontent was growing. Rations were shrinking, supplies were of poor quality, and pay was delayed. They saw the opulence of the general and his inner circle and began to connect the dots. "They fear him," she told Elijah one night, her voice a whisper in the darkness. "But they don't respect him. They talk of a Sergeant Miller, an older man who served at San Jacinto. They say he keeps his mouth shut, but his eyes see everything. Gideon Miller. Elijah remembered him. A quiet man, of few words, but whose loyalty to Texas was unquestionable. Miller was the kind of man who followed orders, but who distinguished between an order and a sacrilege. Elijah's plan began to take shape. He didn't need an army. He needed a single crack in Harrison's armor, and that crack would be the truth. He began to document everything: the dates of confiscations, the names of the merchants doing business with the general, the inconsistencies in supply reports Adeline managed to obtain from a sympathetic clerk. It was dangerous, slow work. Each piece of information was a mortal risk, but every humiliation suffered planted something new within him, something that grew stronger than fear. And fear, he noticed, as he observed Harrison's increasingly frequent patrols around his property, was all that General Marshal Carver Harrison truly possessed. The colonel didn't know it, but by stepping onto that ranch, he had just awakened the wrong man. The silence phase began. To the world, and especially to General Harrison, Elijah Coleman seemed a broken man. He stopped going into town. He remained on his farm, doing only what was necessary to survive. Harrison, in his arrogance, interpreted this as a victory. He saw Elijah's submission as confirmation of his absolute power, proof that fear was the most effective whip. But Elijah's silence was the silence of the earth before an earthquake. It was an active, vigilant silence. Adeline continued her work at the market, transforming from a rancher's wife into a born intelligence gatherer. She learned to read between the lines of the soldiers' complaints, to identify who was disillusioned but still had a spark of honor. It was she who arranged the meeting. One night, under the pretense of delivering a batch of homemade remedies, she went to Gideon Miller's house. The old sergeant received her with suspicion, his face a mask of neutrality. But when she uttered the words Elijah had instructed her to say, "The strongest oak bends most in the storm, but never breaks its root," a phrase Miller's father used to say, the sergeant understood. He was not a traitor, but his loyalty was to Texas, not to Harrison. The meeting between Elijah and Gideon Miller took place in a dry creek bed, in the dim light of dawn. There were no handshakes, only the exchange of glances between men who understood the cost of freedom. Elijah didn't ask Miller to rebel. He asked for something much subtler. "The general trusts you, Sergeant. He keeps you close because your reputation as a war hero legitimizes his command. But he doesn't expect you to think." Elijah handed Miller a small portion of the evidence he had gathered, a falsified receipt for livestock sales. "Just keep your eyes open," Elijah said. "The truth has its own weight." The small seed of doubt was planted. Gideon Miller began to observe, and what he saw confirmed his worst suspicions. He saw ammunition crates destined for the front being diverted to smugglers. He heard Harrison negotiating the sale of reallocated lands to Louisiana speculators. He saw the luxury of the headquarters contrasting with the ragged uniforms of the recruits. Miller's loyalty, forged in the fires of revolution, could no longer tolerate that charade. He didn't become a spy, but a silent guardian of the truth. He began making copies of orders, memorizing conversations, building a mental dossier that corroborated Elijah's every claim. The first small victory came unexpectedly. Harrison was planning a grand show of force, a military parade to impress a visiting politician. The operation depended on a shipment of new horses that was due to arrive from the east. Elijah, knowing the route through Miller's information, used his knowledge of the terrain. He He didn't attack the caravan. He simply caused a stampede of wild cattle at the exact moment the horses were passing through a narrow ravine. Chaos was total. Horses scattered. No one was injured. No shots were fired. But Harrison's parade was canceled. It was a public humiliation. The general was furious, but there was no evidence of sabotage. It was deemed an accident, bad luck. But Elijah knew, and Miller did too. It was a sign that the general's power was not absolute. Hope, once an almost extinguished ember, began to receive oxygen. Elijah knew he needed more. He needed unquestionable authority to present the evidence. The local politicians were all in Harrison's pocket. It was then that a rumor reached Adeline's ears at the market, a rumor that made her heart race. A group of provisional government representatives was making a surprise inspection of the border garrisons. No one knew their names, only that they had the authority to remove commanders. It was the chance, a single chance. Elijah wrote a letter. It was not an accusation, but an appeal. He sealed it not with his name, but with the symbol of his old unit, a unit that had fought alongside the Tennessee Volunteers. He handed it to a trusted teamster, a man who owed him his life, with instructions to deliver it to any representative he encountered on the road east. It was a shot in the dark, a prayer cast to the wind. The powerful laughed at Elijah Coleman's downfall, thinking he had given up. Little did they know, the silence was just the sound before the shot. The day of the inspection arrived, gray and oppressive, as if the very sky of Texas was holding its breath. General Harrison had turned the fort into a theater. Soldiers wore freshly laundered uniforms, weapons were polished, and a facade of order and discipline masked the rot within. To complete his charade, Harrison had Elijah arrested. The official charge was sedition and sabotage, citing the incident with the horses as proof. It was the final act of his triumph. He would not only take the man's land, but destroy his name and use him as a warning. Elijah offered no resistance. As the soldiers led him away, his gaze met Adeline's. In it, there was no fear, but a silent message. Trust the plan. Before the public hearing, which would be more of a sham trial than an inquiry, Harrison ordered Elijah to be brought to his private quarters. The room was opulent, filled with framed maps and expensive furniture. The contrast with the cell where Elijah had spent the night was grotesque. Harrison poured himself a glass of whiskey, the picture of self-confidence. He approached Elijah, who stood handcuffed, but with his spine erect. "It's all lost, Coleman," the traitor whispered, his voice low and full of venomous pleasure. "The representative is already here. He will see a general in control and a traitor in chains, but I am a merciful man." He leaned in, his breath smelling of alcohol and corruption. "Pretend you're my general. Kneel. Confess your treason publicly. Say you acted out of greed, that you regret it. In return, perhaps your wife will live to see another winter." The proposition was the ultimate humiliation, to destroy not only his body and reputation, but his soul. Elijah remained silent, his gaze fixed on the door behind Harrison. He could hear footsteps approaching in the hall. "Your last chance, farmer," Harrison sneered. At that very moment, the door opened, not with a bang, but with a quietude that commanded respect. Standing in the threshold was not a politician in a starched suit or a bureaucrat from Austin. It was a man dressed in buckskin, his face weathered by sun and time, carrying an old rifle with the familiarity of an extension of his own body. His eyes, a piercing blue, assessed the scene in an instant. The arrogant general, the honorable prisoner, Davy Crockett, didn't raise his voice. The power in his presence needed no volume. He took a step into the room, and the air seemed to grow thinner, "General," Crockett said, his tone calm, but with the hardness of steel. "Was I explaining to Soldier Coleman the strategies for defending Texas? Because what I just heard sounded more like a coward's strategy for defending himself." Marshal Carver Harrison's face went from red with rage to white with panic. He stammered, trying to regain his composure. "Colonel Crockett, sir, this man is a traitor. Crockett raised his hand, and the general fell silent. Behind him entered two men of his trust and Sergeant Gideon Miller. Miller didn't look at Harrison. He took his place beside Crockett, his face impassive, and placed a sheaf of papers on the general's desk. The diverted orders, the sales records, the silent testimonies. Crockett picked up the letters Elijah had sent. "I received a message from a man from a fine unit," he said, his gaze fixed on Harrison. "He didn't ask for revenge. He asked for justice. He said Texas's honor was being auctioned off in this garrison." Harrison's authority crumbled like smoke. The guards outside, seeing Crockett and Miller, hesitated. Their loyalty, which Harrison had bought with fear, now turned to the man who had earned it with respect. The truth, gathered by a rancher, guarded by a sergeant, and delivered by a legend, was more powerful than an army. Harrison lost everything in that instant. Not his life, but something he valued more: his power, his prestige, his mask. Crockett turned to Miller. "Sergeant, remove this man's insignia. He is no longer an officer of the Texas Army." When the townspeople gathered in the square and saw Marshal Carver Harrison being led away, without his uniform, without his arrogance, just a small defeated man, no one cheered. They simply tipped their hats in respect to the rancher who had brought justice without firing a single shot. A year later, the morning sun cast a golden light over the fields of the Coleman farm. The corn grew tall and strong, and the sound heard was not of soldiers' hooves, but Adeline's laughter as she played with their young son on the porch. Elijah was mending the same fence he had been repairing the day Harrison arrived. His hands were still those of a farmer, but there was a peace on his countenance that hadn't existed before. He had reclaimed his land, but more importantly, he had defended its meaning. Justice hadn't been a violent storm, but a steady rain that cleans the earth and allows good things to grow again. Marshal Carver Harrison was not executed. Crockett insisted on a proper military trial. Stripped of his rank and his illicit fortune, he was exiled, condemned to live with the only thing he truly feared: insignificance. He became a footnote in history, a warning of how ambition can lead a man to betray everything he swore to protect. Elijah's victory wasn't just personal, it inspired others. The ranchers in the region, once intimidated, united, forming a council to ensure no commander could again abuse their power. They learned that freedom wasn't just a right to be received, but a responsibility to be guarded. Gideon Miller's name was restored with honor, and he became a respected leader in the community. That example that true loyalty is to principles, not to men. One day, a young traveler stopped at Elijah's farm for water. He saw the prosperity of the land and the peace of the family. "They say Davy Crockett himself was here," the boy said, his eyes shining with admiration. "They say he single-handedly faced down a corrupt general." Elijah smiled and offered the young man a piece of cornbread made by Adeline. "Crockett reminded us what is right," Elijah said simply. "But the courage to defend what is right has to come from each of us, from the soil, from faith. Texas doesn't belong to who commands. It belongs to who stands tall." The lesson was clear, etched into the landscape and the hearts of the people. Freedom is not guaranteed by generals in their headquarters, but by ordinary men and women who, when confronted with injustice, refuse to bend. They are the true soul of Texas. The powerful called Elijah a cray. Fool. The people called him a hero, but he knew the truth. Courage needs no witnesses, only a cause. And his always was and always would be Texas. If you were moved by this story of honor and courage, subscribe to our channel. Share this video with everyone who identifies with the pride of fighting for what's right and the values that founded great nations. Leave a comment telling us which city or country you are watching from. Your participation strengthens our community. Until the next story.